The Dead Man's Tale by Willard E. Hawkins. The curious narrative that follows was found among the papers of the late Dr. John Pedrick, psychical investigator and author of occult works. It bears evidence of having been received through automatic writing, as were several of his publications. Unfortunately, there are no records to confirm this assumption, and none of the mediums or assistants employed by him in his research work admits knowledge of it. Possibly, for the doctor was reputed to possess some psychic powers, it may have been received by him. At any rate, the lack of data renders the recital useless as a document for the Society for Psychical Research. It is published for whatever intrinsic interest or significance it may possess. With reference to the names mentioned, it may be added that they are not confirmed by the records of the War Department. It could be maintained, however, that purposely fictitious names were substituted, either by the doctor or the communicating entity. 1. They called me, when I walked the earth in the body of dense matter, Richard Devaney. Though my story has little to do with the war, I was killed in the Second Battle of the Marne on July 24th, 1918. Many times, as men were wont to do who felt the daily, hourly imminence of death in the trenches, I had pictured that event in my mind and wondered what it would be like. Mainly, I had inclined toward a belief in total extinction, that when the vigorous, full-blooded body I possessed should lie bereft of its faculties, I, as a creature apart from it, should go on, was beyond credence. The play of life through the human machine, I reasoned, was like the flow of gasoline into the motor of an automobile. Shut off that flow, and the motor became inert, dead, while the fluid which had given it power was in itself nothing. And so, I confess, it was a surprise to discover that I was dead, and yet not dead. I did not make the discovery at once. There had been a blinding concussion, a moment of darkness, a sensation of falling into a deep abyss. An indefinite time afterward, I found myself standing dazedly on the hillside, towards the crest of which we had been pressing against the enemy. The thought came that I must have momentarily lost consciousness, yet now I felt strangely free from the physical discomfort. What had I been doing when that moment of blackness blotted everything out? I had been dominated by a purpose, a flaming desire. Like a flash, recollection burst upon me, and with it a blaze of hatred, not towards the bushy gunners ensconced in the woods above us, but towards the private enemy I had been about to kill. It had been the opportunity for which I had waited interminable days and nights. In the opening formation, he kept a few paces ahead of me. As we alternately ran forward, then dropped on our bellies and fired, I had watched my chance. No one would suspect, with the dozens who were falling every moment under the merciless fire from the trees beyond, that the bullet which ended Lewis Winston's career came from a comrade's rifle. Twice I had taken aim, but withheld my fire, not from indecision, but lest, in my vengeful heat, I might fail to reach a vital spot. When I raised my rifle the third time, he offered a fair target. God, how I hated him! With fingers itching to speed the steel towards his heart, I forced myself to remain calm, to hold fire for that fragment of a second that would ensure careful aim. Then, as the pressure of my finger tightened against the trigger, came the blinding flash, the moment of blackness. 2. I had evidently remained unconscious longer than I realized. Save for a few figures that lay motionless or squirming in agony on the field, the regiment had passed on, to be lost in the trees at the crest of the hill. With a pang of disappointment, I realized that Lewis would be among them. Involuntarily, I started onward, driven still by that impulse of burning hatred, when I heard my name called. Turning in surprise, I saw a helmeted figure crouching beside something huddled in the tall grass. No second glance was needed to tell me that the huddled something was the body of a soldier. I had eyes only for the man who was bending over him. Fate had been kind to me. It was Lewis. Apparently, in his preoccupation, he had not noticed me. Coolly, I raised my rifle and fired. The result was startling. Lewis neither dropped headlong nor looked up at the report. Vaguely, I questioned whether there had been a report. Thwarted, I felt the lust to kill mounting in me with redoubled fury. With rifle upraised, I ran towards him. A terrific swing, and I crashed the stock against his head. It passed clear through. Lewis remained unmoved. Uncomprehending, snarling, I flung the useless weapon away and fell upon him with bare hands, with fingers that strained to rend and tear and strangle. Instead of encountering solid flesh and bone, they too passed through him. Was it a mirage? A dream? Had I gone crazy? Sobered for a moment, forgetful of my fury, I drew back and tried to reduce the thing to reason. Was Lewis but a figment of the imagination? A phantom? My glance fell upon the figure beside which he was sobbing incoherent words of entreaty. I gave a start, then looked more closely. The dead man, for there was no question about his condition with a bloody shrapnel wound in the side of his head, was myself. Gradually the import of this penetrated my consciousness. Then I realized it was Lewis who had called my name, that even now he was sobbing it over and over. The irony of it struck me at the moment of realization. I was dead. I, the phantom, who had meant to kill Lewis. I looked at my hands, my uniform. I touched my body. Apparently I was as substantial as before the shrapnel buried itself in my head, yet when I had tried to grasp Lewis, my hand seemed to encompass only space. Lewis lived, and I was dead. The discovery for a time benumbed my feelings towards him. With impersonal curiosity, I saw him close the eyes of the man who, somehow or other, had been me. I saw him search the pockets and draw forth a letter I had written only that morning, a letter addressed to... With a sudden surge of dismay, I darted forward to snatch it from his hands. He should not read that letter. Again, I was reminded of my impalpability, but Lewis did not open the envelope, although it was unsealed. He read the superscriptions, kissed it as sobs rent his frame, and thrust the letter inside his khaki jacket. "Dick, buddy," he cried brokenly. "Best pal I ever had. How can I take this news back to her?" My lips curled. To Lewis, I was his pal, his buddy. Not a suspicion of the hate I had borne him ever since I discovered him a rival for Velma Roth. Oh, I had been clever. It was our unselfish friendship that endeared us both to her. A sign of jealousy, of ill nature, and I would have forfeited the paradise of her regard that apparently I shared with Lewis. I had never felt secure of my place in that paradise. True, I could always awaken a response in her, but I must put forth effort in order to do so. He held her interest, it seemed, without trying. They were happy with each other, and in each other. Our relations might be expressed by likening her to the water of a placid pool, Lewis to the basin that held her, me to the wind that swept over it. By exerting myself, I could agitate the surface of her nature into ripples of pleasurable excitement, could even lash her emotions into a tempest. She responded to the stimulation of my mood, yet, in my absence, settled contentedly into the peaceful comfort of Lewis's steadfast love. I felt vaguely then, and am certain now, with a broader perspective towards realities, that Velma intuitively recognized Lewis as her mate, yet feared to yield herself to him because of my sway over her emotional nature. When the Great War came, we all, I am convinced, felt that it would absolve Velma from the task of choosing between us. Whether the agony that spoke from the violet depths of her eyes when we said goodbye was chiefly for Lewis or for me, I could not tell. I doubt if she could have done so. But in my mind was the determination that only one of us should return, and Lewis would not be that one. Did I feel no repugnance at thought of murdering the man who stood in my way? Very little. I was a savage at heart, a savage in whom desire outweighed anything that might stand in the way of gaining its object. From my point of view, I would have been a fool to pass the opportunity. Why I should have so hated him, a mere obstacle in my path, I do not know. It may have been due to a prescience of the intangible barrier his blood would always raise between Velma and me, or to a slumbering sense of remorse. But, speculation aside, here I was, in a state of being that the world calls death, while Lewis lived, was free to return home, to claim Velma, to flaunt his possession of all that I held precious. It was maddening. Must I stand idly by, helpless to prevent this? 3. I have wondered since how could I remain so long in touch with the objective world, why I did not at once, or very soon, find myself shut off from the earthly sights and sounds as those in physical form are shut off from the things beyond. The matter seems to have been determined by my will. Like weights of lead, envy of Lewis and passionate longing for Velma held my feet to the sphere of dense matter. Vengeful, despairing, I watched beside Lewis. When at last he turned away from my body and, with tears streaming from his eyes, began to drag a useless leg toward the trenches we had left, I realized why he had not gone on with the others to the crest of the hill. He, too, was a victim of Boucher gunnery. I walked beside the stretcher-bearers when they had picked him up and were conveying him towards the base hospital. Throughout the weeks that followed, I hovered near his cot, watching the doctors as they bound up the lacerated tendons in his thigh, and missing no detail of his battle with the fever. Over his shoulder I read the first letter he wrote home to Velma, in which he gave a belated account of my death, dwelling upon the glory of my sacrifice. "I have often thought that you two were meant for each other," he wrote, "and that if it had not been for fear of hurting me, you would have been his wife long ago. He was the best buddy a man ever had. If only I could have been the one to die." Had I known it, I could have followed this letter across seas, could, in fact, have passed it and, by an exercise of the will, been at Velma's side in the twinkling of an eye. But my ignorance of the laws of the new plane was total. All my thoughts were centered upon a problem of entirely different character. Never was hold upon earthly treasure more reluctantly relinquished than was my hope of possessing Velma. Surely death could not erect so absolute a barrier. There must be a way, some loophole of communication, some chance for a disembodied man to contend with his corporeal rival for a woman's love. Slowly, very slowly, dawned the light of a plan. So feeble was the glimmer that it would scarcely have comforted one in less desperate straits, but to me it appeared to offer a possible hope. I set about methodically, with infinite patience, evolving it into something tangible, even though I had but the most indefinite idea of what the outcome might be. The first suggestion came when Lewis had so far recovered that but little trace of the fever remained. One afternoon, as he lay sleeping, the mail distributor handed a letter to the nurse who happened to be standing beside his cot. She glanced at it, then tucked it under his pillow. The letter was from Velma, and I was hungry for the contents. I did not then know that I could have read it easily, sealed though it was. In a frenzy of impatience, I exclaimed, "Wake up, confound it, and read your letter!" With a start, he opened his eyes. He looked around with a bewildered expression. "Under your pillow!" I fumed. "Look under your pillow!" In a dazed manner, he put his hand under the pillow and drew forth the letter. A few hours later, I heard him commenting on the experience to the nurse. "Something seemed to wake me up," he said, "and I had a peculiar impulse to feel under the pillow. It was just as if I knew I would find the letter there." The circumstances seemed as remarkable to me as it did to him. It might be coincidence, but I determined to make a further test. A series of experiments convinced me that I could, to a very slight degree, impress my thoughts and will upon Lewis, especially when he was tired or on the borderland of sleep. Occasionally, I was able to control the direction of his thoughts as he wrote home to Velma. On one occasion, he was describing for her a funny little Frenchwoman who visited the hospital with a basket that always was filled with cigarettes and candy. "Last time," he wrote, "she brought with her a boy whom she called—" He paused, with pencil upraised, trying to recall the name. A moment later, he looked down at the page and stared with astonishment. The words, "She called him Maurice," had been added below the unfinished line. "I must be going daffy," he muttered. "I swear I didn't write that." Behind him I stood rubbing my hands in triumph. It was my first successful effort to guide the pencil while his thoughts strayed elsewhere. Another time he wrote to Velma, "I have a strange feeling lately that dear old Dick is near. Sometimes, as I wake up, I seem to remember vaguely having seen him in my dreams. It's as if his features were just fading from view." He paused here so long that I made another attempt to take advantage of his abstraction. By an effort of the will that is difficult to explain, I guided his hand into the formation of the words, "With a jug full of kisses for Winky, as ever her—" Just then Lewis looked down. "Good God!" he exclaimed, as if he had seen a ghost.